Hello, my name is Robert Cibis. I'm very pleased to be here with Dr. Piers Robinson. He is an academic in communication and political sciences, and we will discuss a false flag, if I can say so. Of course, an academic wouldn't put it this way in the first sentence, but this is how I do it because I'm not. We just try to, see what research shows. And as some of our listeners and viewers know, we had a lot of publications regarding the COVID crisis. And in the beginning, you had a lot of people seemingly dying, but this was just in some hospitals. And in other hospitals, it seemed like everything was normal. And if you see the general statistics, most of it was normal too. So what was this is one of the main issues still to uncover today. And in fact, I would say today, and I wouldn't have said that at the time, that this has been a false flag. So this is not the topic, but just to say that this concept is so broad that now with this new glasses on my ears, I see false flags everywhere. I just recently, I had a book dropping out of my shelf, and I just opened it, and it was in fact a business book. And it said, most company mergers are happening, so you can create a state of crisis in the company so that the employed people are keen to change the routine, keen to accept new ways of dealing with things, or also the company can fire people, and this is accepted by both the town where the company is placed and the people. So the crisis, in fact, is a good means to make big changes, and this gets accepted. So we will today talk about a completely different topic, but I just gave these examples of saying that this mechanism is so widespread somehow and can be found in so many different contexts, and there is some extremely obvious, dissonance in the narrative of what happened in Syria. What did you find out, and what can you say for sure today?
Well, for sure. I mean, just to pick up on your point, I like to use the term structural deep events, which is Peter Dale Scott's conceptualization, talking about the crisis politics, creating, instigating, manipulating events in order to basically propagandize people and to deceive people and to manipulate behavior and opinions. And we have sort of big structural deep events such as 9/11 or COVID-19. And then we have sort of as a category below that, deep events or strategic deceptions, which are used in order to realize political goals. So I agree entirely. We're talking about very similar phenomena. That it's all to do with propaganda, it's to do with deception, and it's to do with managing people, mobilizing people. Now, what I've looked at in terms of my research and the work that I've been involved in looking at the war in Syria, which of course initiates in 2011 and is still currently ongoing with a possible escalation at the moment. But what I've looked at in the context of Syria is looking at the question of alleged chemical weapons attacks. Okay, and the sort of underlying question of what is actually going on with these alleged chemical weapons attacks. Because a central plank of essentially Western propaganda campaign in relation to the war in Syria is that the Syrian government systematically uses chemical weapons against its own population. Okay, and that's been part of the process by which there's been an attempt to delegitimate the Syrian government as part of what is essentially a regime change strategy. A regime change strategy which, of course, as we now know from Wesley Clark and from the documents which came out post 9/11, Syria was one of the countries which was in the crosshairs of the regime change wars which were implemented after 9/11. So the idea that the Syrian government's using chemical weapons is the kind of core research area which I've been involved in. And really principally, and I think probably best to focus on, is the alleged chemical weapons attack in Douma in 2018, because this is something which I've become very closely involved with researching. And it's also a case where scientists involved in the investigation of the alleged chemical weapons attack have, over the last 5 years, one way or another, essentially blown the whistle on the corruption of that investigation. And what you have, before going into details, at the broadest level, you have essentially a strategic deception or a propaganda campaign, which is falsely building a narrative which falsely blames these chemical attacks on the Syrian government. The truth is very, very different from that. And that's essentially what the Duma case tells us. Now,
could you just remind us what has been in the news at the time? So it's 2018, you said?
In 2018, in Duma, it's headline news around the world. Two yellow chlorine gas cylinders fell into apartment houses in Duma, which is a suburb of Damascus. And 43 dead civilians were filmed in one of these apartment blocks. And the allegation immediately delivered from the American government and the French and the British was that the Syrian government had carried out a chemical weapons attack in Duma. The initial allegation was that nerve agent had been used, okay, because of the scenario that was there. In terms of a large number of people dead, people foaming at the mouth, and so on. Now, these allegations, even before the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, which is essentially the chemical weapons watchdog, before their fact-finding mission team were even able to start their work in Syria in order to say, well, okay, what has really happened here? There was a military strike on Syria by France, America, and Britain in retaliation. So they bombed within 7 days of the alleged attack before the fact-finding mission was able to begin its investigation.
What has been this fact-finding mission?
Well, the fact-finding missions are very interesting because they're investigation teams which were established specifically in relation to Syria. And they do, in fact, operate not fully within the Chemical Weapons Convention, which is one of the ongoing controversies about these missions. But what these missions were set up to do was to send people in order to try and establish what had happened in the context of the alleged attack in Duma. And what was really quite important about Duma was that this was the first time in many, many years that an inspection team was actually able to get in on the ground. Because prior to this, with all of the other alleged attacks, they always had to rely upon information being supplied by groups such as the White Helmets. But with Duma, they were able to get in on the ground and look at the sites where the cylinders were supposed to have fallen and where the gas is supposed to have been released and so on, to gather witness testimony, gather evidence in terms of chemical evidence, etc. And we're able to carry out a fuller investigation than was the case with the previous alleged attacks. Okay. Now, the long and short of what happened with this investigation, and we didn't know this at the time, this didn't become apparent until a year later when the final report came out. But what transpired with this investigation was that, in fact, it had been corrupted, that people involved in the investigation had already, within a couple of months of the investigation got underway, were essentially protesting internally that there was a manipulation going on. And one of the sort of first instances of this was the publication of an initial report. So the team who had been on the ground had written a report, and the report had highlighted a number of questions. It said that, well, we don't have strong evidence of chlorine gas release. There's no evidence of nerve agents. Half of the witnesses are saying that there was no chemical attack. Also made clear that toxicology experts, NATO toxicology experts who had been consulted, had said that these people in Duma were not killed by chlorine gas. This is not how they died, and there's no evidence of nerve agents. So this was all put into the initial report, and that was essentially secretly removed at the last minute, without the Duma team knowing. And they attempted, the OPCW senior management attempted...
You just have to specify